Hello and welcome to Understanding Transitional Justice. What we're going to be trying to do this week is look at some of the history of transitional justice at efforts before the contemporary period to develop transitional justice initiatives, what has been done. The first section will look at domestic initiatives, and then we'll look at international initiatives. It's meant to give a bit of an overview. Most of the emphasis in the seminar is on the contemporary period, but we want to see what's been done in the past century, especially. And the answer to what has been done is fundamentally not much. That is to say, there is a relatively short history of post-conflict and post-regime justice initiatives. Most of what we have seen have been incoming regimes taking vengeance against the members of an outgoing regime. Very often, those initiatives do not last long either. They become subject to political pressures. But the impulse to revenge is strong, as we can see. It's probably the reason for the failure of many initiatives. I mean, first of all, to achieve justice, and second, to achieve the kind of social consensus, change in popular consciousness that's necessary to sustain a transition. Another problem that we see looking historically at post-conflict and post-regime justice initiatives is that very often they take place through illegal and extra-legal means. That is, we are talking about ad hoc tribunals, public trials, show trials taking place at the end of the war, at the end of a regime, which are selective and in which the quality of evidence, the quality of fairness are poor. All the same, we can talk, especially beginning in the 1970s, with the beginning of what turned out to be a large-scale wave of democratization in South and Central America, a lot of experimentation, a lot of efforts to break the cycle that seemed to develop from the 1930s onward of frequent frequent alternation in power between elected regimes deposed by military coups, which would then be pressured to hold elections, to elect a democratic regime that would be deposed again, and so on. In the 1970s and especially in the 1980s, you began to see efforts to try to break that cycle by the development of initiatives to establish justice and accountability. Probably the first major one that really got a lot of attention and had a major effect was after the change of regime in Argentina in 1986, when there was an effort to place on trial first the heads of the military regime that had been taken out of power, high-ranking military officers and high-ranking police officers. This was an effort that was preceded by the appointment of an investigative commission, a commission on the fate of missing persons, which produced an extensive report detailing the reasons behind the repression carried out by the military regime, the processes that the repression used, and in an annex, a list of the victims. This was an effort, though, that met with increasing resistance on the part of the military and the police, whose officers felt threatened. There was especially a fear that the scope of prosecution could expand to be so wide that a large number of currently ranking officers would be subject to prosecution. And so there were both military and police rebellions, which led to another cycle, a series of efforts in which the state attempted to put a moratorium on further prosecutions. Then local activists would find a way around a moratorium, engage in prosecutions based on different issues and different questions, which would break it. And another moratorium would be imposed, and so on. What's interesting about this period, and you saw similar processes in Colombia, in Venezuela, in Uruguay, in Chile, there was an effort to replace prosecution with a more exhaustive truth commission, which ended up breaking down. But this took several years because this was really the first large-scale encounter of incoming elected regimes with large-scale citizen-led movements seeking to establish justice and imposing justice as a condition for for the achievement and consolidation of democratic rule. We saw a further development in this in South Africa with the end of the apartheid regime. Now, one of the conditions under which the apartheid regime was agreed to leave power was that there be an amnesty for crimes committed under the regime, that is, an amnesty for prosecution. So the incoming regime, headed by Nelson Mandela, was unable to engage in large-scale prosecutions and appointed instead this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So this was an effort to work under the constraints imposed by an agreed amnesty, and this is a condition that you'll find in a lot of changes of regime, that very often regimes do not change because of a revolution or a military defeat or some kind of condition that imposes absolute loss on the outgoing party, but because of an agreement in which the outgoing regime permits the incoming regime to take power, but imposes conditions on them. So they were working within the constraints of that, and the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission introduced a lot of innovations that came to be influential in the development of commissions. One of them was that they introduced a process of forgiveness. That is, people who had committed crimes were invited to confess to their crimes and to ask for forgiveness from the victims or from families of the victims, who were free publicly to grant or to refuse to give this forgiveness. So there was an effort to kind of introduce some kinds of therapeutic elements of social healing into the process. The other fact about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission that proved to be influential, the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as you probably already know, was a very prominent religious figure, Desmond Tutu, who was the Archbishop of the Anglican Church in South Africa. And Desmond Tutu developed a discourse which integrated culture with processes of investigation and reconciliation. He said that that healing, that forgiveness were a part of the traditional cultures of South Africa, and he tried to harness them to the process so that investigation and the finding of facts and the publication of facts could be a part of the process of social healing. And this gesture to integrate religious and cultural institutions into post-conflict and post-regime justice initiatives is one that has been very influential in other states in Africa that have appointed commissions, has been less influential in some other states, and this is probably partly because of the shape of cultural influence, and it's partly because of the political role of religious institutions in many other states, in states in Europe and in South and Central America. Another moment that proved to be important was the moment of post-communist transition in the part of Europe that had had state socialist regimes. Now, this was a case, generally speaking, the transitions that took place were pacted transitions, that is, the results of agreements in which the ruling party had consented to leave power or consented to hold elections in consideration of some conditions, but there were further constraints on the incoming elected regimes in the post-communist world. One of them was that they took over a state apparatus, including a security apparatus, the police, military, judicial apparatus, from the outgoing regime. That is, that they had to work with institutions that were intensely engaged with and compromised with the outgoing regime in order to consolidate the power of the new regime, which made the work very difficult, and it limited the extent to which they were able to move against people, even if it was known that they had been complicit in the commission of abuses. Second, there was an absence of what might be called democratic unity or democratic consensus. That is, there was not complete agreement among all people in all parts of the society that that the goal was the establishment of a democratic state based on rule of law and based on the realization of justice. There were elements of resistance to this. There were parties operating in the environment that had goals that conflicted with this. So given the fact that not all members of the society shared the same motivation, there was further constraint on the scope of action that was possible in post-communist regimes. And then there is the further element. It's probably important to understand that in the period of state socialism, the level of complicity with security agencies and other agencies of repression in most states was very extensive, whether this was by force or whether this was by choice. So that it was hard to find very many people with institutional experience that would qualify them for a career in public administration and politics who were not in some way compromised. And so the records of the no longer existing secret police agencies and similar agencies became a source in which it was possible to identify people who had been collaborators with the regime in the previous period and to use this information to disqualify them as political opponents. And this was engaged in extensively on the political level, on the individual level, by media, which had the tendency to denigrate the position of the pursuit of justice and make it look as though justice was subordinated to the pursuit of political power. Now, most of what we talk about when we talk about post-conflict and post-regime justice is a set of initiatives in the field of criminal justice, that is, efforts to prosecute people who had committed crimes and abuses. But these are not the only initiatives that exist, and there are non-judicial, I would say non-legal, by which I do not mean illegal, but I mean taking place outside of the context of judicial and criminal justice institutions that probably ought to be mentioned. One of the sets of initiatives has to do with efforts of documenting abuses and of making public apologies, and this has been very common in many parts of the English-speaking world, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, where various types of abuses, the imprisonment of Japanese American citizens in the United States during the Second World War, the destruction of Native American communities and cultures in Canada and Australia, have been met by the production of reports revealing fundamental facts about the incidents, and then the issuance of apologies by some sort of public body, a legislative or executive body, for these actions. Some initiatives have dealt with the effort to provide compensation to victims, and in fact, after the end of the Second World War in France, a very extensive policy was developed to provide compensation to victims of human rights abuses. What happened with this is that very quickly, through the testing of the mechanisms of seeking compensation for abuses, this was a law that was meant to provide compensation to victims of abuses that had been committed in the context of the Second World War, both by the German occupying power and by the collaborationist regime in France. But other victims of other abuses emerged to claim compensation, particularly victims of abuses related to colonialism, that is, to French rule over territories in other parts of the world, in particular in Algeria, where a conflict was very intense. And very quickly, this law became reinterpreted so as to restrict the ability of courts to provide compensation. That compensation could be provided freely to victims of abuses in the Second World War, and much less freely to victims of abuses committed in the course of colonialism. And of course, when we're talking about non-judicial initiatives, about initiatives taking place through institutions of culture and communication and education and the arts, it would be impossible not to put a very great emphasis on post-World War II Germany, where there was a concerted effort, particularly after 1969, 1965, 1970, to educate the public about the facts of the genocides and other abuses that have been committed during the Second World War, to develop a sense of public responsibility for them, in which individual responsibility of people as members of the community would be combined with institutional responsibility, in which the state takes a role not only in providing compensation, but in providing recognition and in offering regularly statements of responsibility and of apologies. Generally speaking, when people talk about transformations of public memory and of public consciousness in a post-regime and post-conflict environment, if anybody wants to raise a successful example, that is one in which social consciousness really has changed to such a way that the acceptance of responsibility is general, then they will use post-World War II Germany as an example. And this is a question that I am not certain that I can answer briefly, but I certainly can raise and would be happy to discuss in the seminar. That is, what are the factors that account for what appears to be the success of Germany in this process? So this is what I'll say for now to give an overview of domestic initiatives in several states in the area of post-regime and post-conflict justice. In the next section of this presentation, I will talk about international initiatives and try to place those in context.